Hi, it's Mr. Ed again, and I'm here to talk about some common errors of things you're going to be seeing in some trig functions coming up. Now, right here in front of you, you see two different trig functions, 2 cosine of x and cosine of 2x. Now, the question is, are these two trig functions the same thing? Are they equal to each other? Now, some people argue, yes, of course they're equal to each other. This is like 2x, and this is like x times 2. And we've learned in math that it doesn't matter what order you multiply things in, that 2 times 3 is the same thing as 3 times 2. They're both 6. And while this is true, it actually does not apply in this particular case. What is actually happening here, that is actually not what's happening. What's actually happening here is this is sort of like 2 times x. Imagine that this is like 2 times x squared, and let's compare that to 2 times x squared. Now, I know there are no exponents here on the trig function, as I know, but this is the closest that we can kind of come to in algebra. So you can kind of see that they look very much alike. And if you're in Algebra 1, a lot of Algebra 1 students think these two things are exactly the same thing. We see 2 times x, and we see an exponent of 2. These should both equal the same thing. But we do know that they're not actually the same thing. This is just 2x squared. It can't go any further. But this actually turns out to be, if you work it out, 4x squared. And so these two things, which while they look very much alike in the beginning, are not really exactly the same thing. Now, it's the same with these cosines, all right? This is 2 times cosine of x. And this is the cosine of 2x. You're doubling the angle, right? It's similar to doing something like this. Let's pretend x was, say, 45. So it'd be the 2 times cosine of 45 degrees, right? And then we'll see if that's the same thing as cosine of 2 times 45 degrees, right? Are these two things the same? Well, 2 times cosine of 45 is just that. You really can't go much further, right? Well, actually, I guess you can a little bit because we do know the cosine of 45 degrees turns out to be root 2 over 2, right? And then these two would cancel and you just get root 2 as your final answer, right? That's if we start with that. However, if we start with this, you would actually multiply these two together first, and 2 times 45 is 90 degrees. And what's the cosine of 90 degrees? Well, the cosine of 90 degrees, I'll give you a hint, it's not root 2. The cosine of 90 degrees is 0. And so these two things, 2 times the cosine of 45 and the cosine of 2 times 45, were not the same thing. They were not equal to each other, right? So when you have a number in front, that's the same 2 times whatever the value of cosine x is. And this is cosine of 2x. That means you multiply the angle first and then figure out its cosine. There are, I suppose, some very rare cases where those two things would be the same, but that's the exception, not the rule. As a general rule, these two things are not the same. So be very careful about confusing them because they are not equivalent. If the 2 is with the x, it means you're doubling the angle. If the 2 is in front of the cosine, it means you're finding that angle and then taking that answer and multiplying it by 2. Now, keeping that in mind, similarly, these two things are also not exactly the same thing. Cosine squared and cosine x squared are not the same thing. They're not the same. And they're not equal to each other. You can't just like move around the exponent of 2, right? This means find the cosine of x and take that answer and square it. And this means take the angle, square it, and then find its cosine. And they are not the same thing. They did not work out the same way, just much in the same way that these two things were not true. You can't just like, well, I'll just move around the exponent and it'll all be the same thing. Right? When you move things like exponents, it's not always equivalent. And the same thing with trig functions. If you just move numbers around, it is actually not the same thing. When you can't move things around, we call it not commutative. Commutative means you can move things around. Right? Some things in math are commutative, where like you said, with 2 times 3 and 3 times 2 are the same. And some things are not, like exponents. Exponents are not commutative. You cannot just move them around and have it be the same thing. So just be aware because we're going to be seeing a lot of these in the future where we have the cosine of 2x or the sine of 2x or the tangent of 2x, and it is not the same thing as having the 2 in front. So just want to give you a heads up about that.